deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, remains unreadable to this day. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what their kings believed, what prayers they spoke, or what truly happened behind the walls of numbers. All we have are their ruins, their art, and their influence, absorbed later by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just builders of palaces. They were architects of mystery. And Knos wasn't merely a building. It was the beating heart of a civilization that shimmered for a moment like sunlight on the Aegean and then vanished. But some say their echo still wanders the maze. To walk through Knossos
is to walk through time.
Layered, confusing, beautiful time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms you. It's the design. Rooms lead to rooms. Corridors split and vanish. Light wells cut through the heart of the building. Stairs spiral into shadows or emerge suddenly into sunlit courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. It's not hard to see why ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth. Knossos wasn't just a palace. It was a living organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex contained over 1,000 chambers. Some tiny, some grand. These weren't randomly placed rooms. They were purpose-built workshops, storage spaces, shrines, apartments, and throne rooms, all arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or bulling rituals. The palace was built on multiple levels up to 4 or 5 stories tall in places using natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate it without getting lost, you'd need memory, instinct, or a thread like Theseus. And yet this apparent chaos hides a remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts and open stairwells. They funneled rainwater through clay pipes and had toilets that flushed long before Rome made it fashionable. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair built into the wall flanked by benches. Around it are fresco of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king? A goddess's chamber? A sacred court?
No.
One knows for certain. And the walls, they speak in color. Vibrant frescoes show dolphins swimming above bathtubs. Women in elegant flounced skirts with bare chests. Youths leaping bulls midair. The art wasn't just decoration. It was identity. Fluid, natural, deeply connected to earth and sea. Still, the deeper you go, the more Knos begins to disorient. Some parts seem intentionally complex, like they were designed to confuse. Maybe that's the root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive. A building that invited awe, ritual, and just a touch of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question where you were and what was waiting around the next corner. Knos wasn't just an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, steeped in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no towering columns to Zeus or marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, woven into the fabric of the building itself. Shrines hide in corners. Pillars rise like sacred sentinels. Horns stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the bull motif dominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans didn't seem to fear the bull. They celebrated it. The famous bull leaping fresco in Knos isn't just athletic art. It may depict a religious rite. Young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of danger and grace. It wasn't sport. It was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses discovered in storerooms beneath the palace. The snake goddess figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-breasted, arms raised, with serpents coiled in their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are guardians of the household, fertility, and perhaps life itself. To the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery. Creatures of both earth and underworld. The rooms where these objects were found hint at household shrines or ritual spaces, quiet, sacred corners hidden among the palic's bustling heart. Combined with the fresco, the horns, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There is no centralized temple at Knos because the palace itself was a temple. Its layout, art, and design were all part of a spiritual worldview where boundaries between sacred and secular didn't exist. This was a place where myth was architecture, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. Knos didn't just house people. It housed gods. For centuries, Knos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. But then, something happened, something sudden, something no one can fully explain. By around 1400 BC, the palace was abandoned, the fresco left to fade, and the Minoan civilization that once ruled the seas had vanished like mist over the Ion. So what happened? Theories abound.
Some point to nature.
Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions in human history.
The blast
Was so massive it likely caused tsunamis that battered Cite's northern coast, devastating ports and farmland. Ash clouds may have blocked the sun, choking crops and disrupting the climate. While Knossos wasn't immediately destroyed, the aftermath of the eruption may have shaken the foundations economically, politically, and spiritually. Others looked to war. By 1450 BC, the rising power of the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have taken advantage of Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence suggests Knos was reoccupied briefly, but the culture had changed. The art became more martial. Linear A, the Minoan script, was replaced with Linear B, used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bull dancers now whispered in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't invade in a single conquest, but gradually absorbed the island. First through trade, then influence, and finally rule. Others argue that internal collapse, a civil uprising, political instability, or the failure of the elite may have contributed just as much. What's striking, though, is how little violence is evident in the ruins. There are no charred skeletons, no signs of mass slaughter. Knos didn't fall with a scream. It fell with a whisper. The great palatial system simply
stopped.
The rooms went quiet. The rituals ended, and nature slowly crept back in. By the time Homer sang of Cree in his epics, Knos was already ancient myth, a memory tangled in stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. And maybe that's fitting, because what killed Knos wasn't just eruption or invasion. It was time, and the way all great things, no matter how beautiful, eventually vanish beneath the weight of new empires. But the bones remain. And if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil. Just another mound of stone lost to time. Its name forgotten, its myths distorted, its walls swallowed by olive groves and dust. That is, until one man decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans. And he didn't just rediscover Knossos, he reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for drama and a deep love for Homeric myth, purchased the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local farmers had been finding strange seals and artifacts, clues that something enormous lay beneath their feet. Evans dug in. What he found would change the history of the Ion forever. He uncovered a palace so vast, so complex, and so advanced that he was convinced this was the mythical home of King Minos. The fresco, the horns, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site. It all pointed in his mind to one thing: the labyrinth. Evans wasn't just an archaeologist. He was a storyteller and, sometimes a controversial one. He named the people who built Knos the Minoans after Minos. He interpreted symbols, reconstructed fresco, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a move that has drawn both praise and criticism. Some call it visionary, others call it vandalism. Because what you see today at Knossos is partly ancient ruin and partly Edgewardian imagination. Still, Evans did what no one else had dared. He brought Knossos back to life. He gave Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age world far older than classical Greece, a civilization of art, mystery, and maritime elegance. He also unearthed the still undeciphered linear script, opening new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than excavate stone. He resurrected a myth and forced historians to reckon with the fact that behind the legend of the labyrinth was something real, something complex, something very human, a palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that slipped into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth, only to discover a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had imagined. Knossos had slept for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that woke it up. Walk through Knossos, and you're not just walking through architecture. You're walking through a language of symbols. Fresco, carvings, patterns, they're everywhere. But the Manawans didn't leave us a Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. So instead of reading their thoughts, we must see them painted across plaster, carved into walls, and hidden in patterns. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of Knossos is unlike anything in the ancient world. There's no obsession with warfare, no rows of kings or battle-hardened heroes. Instead, we find nature, leaping dolphins, blooming lilies, birds in flight, and sacred bowls. The humans are alive, elegant, and often dancing or performing rituals. Even in scenes that suggest danger, there's rhythm and beauty. The Minoans weren't chronicling conquests. They were celebrating life cycles and possibly cosmic order. The most iconic symbol, though, is the double axe or labris. Found throughout Knossos shrines on fresco, even etched into stones. The double axe is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly tied to female divinity or celestial cycles. Some suggest the very word labyrinth might derive from labis, making the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed at top walls and altars. These may have been religious markers separating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent depictions of bulls and bull-whipping rituals, it's clear the animal had deep spiritual significance. Whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence, no one agrees. But the bull is everywhere. Even the layout of Knossos may have symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was built not just for function, but to mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, through the underworld, a spiritual maze, not a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a thin line between insight and imagination. The Manawans spoke in symbols, not stories. And so we're left to interpret.
What is Knossos saying?
We hear the rhythms. We see the images, but the meaning that remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't feel dead. Walk its corridors today, and you'll sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths, of lives, of questions that refuse to go away. Thousands of years after its fall, Knossos still holds us in its maze. Tourists wander its halls, archaeologists dig for answers, and writers spin new tales inspired by its shadow. The Minotaur may be myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real. We don't know who ruled Numbers. We don't know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We don't know the prayers they whispered or the laws they lived by. But we know they loved beauty. We know they worshipped nature. We know they understood balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were the first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos. A palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story. because perhaps that's what the labyrinth really is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur didn't arise from nothing. It came from this place, from the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the awe it inspired in generations who tried to make sense of it. The Greeks turned it into story. We turned it into archaeology. But at its core, Nos has always been both. Today, we can walk its ruins in broad daylight. We can take photos, draw maps, and even reconstruct its fresco. But the mystery hasn't vanished. The line between fact and legend still shimmers like heat over stone. Maybe that's why Gnosis endures, because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be felt. And Nos, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't just a place on a map. It's a question. One that leads us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we're all still following the thread. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The earliest rams were handheld. Teams of soldiers simply lifted a tree trunk and smashed it against enemy defenses like frenzied lumberjacks. But over time, the battering ram evolved. Engineers realized that mounting the ram inside a wheeled frame, often with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, turned it from a tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare, turned rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with archer platforms, meaning a city's gates were being destroyed while defenders were under constant fire. Relief carvings from Nineveh show rams with pointed iron tips rolling up to the gates of rebellious cities like slow-moving gods of destruction. And it wasn't just the front door they were smashing. Rams were often used to breach weak points in walls, batter down watchtowers, or collapse gateaus entirely. Their presence meant one thing: surrender or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built massive rams called ares, Latin for ram, suspended with chains or ropes inside enormous siege shelters. Some were so big they needed dozens of men to operate. And the rhythm of their swinging beam was said to sound like thunder rolling across stone. And yet, for all their brute force, battering rams required serious teamwork. Operators had to keep the ram swinging in sync while also defending it from burning missiles, stones, and all manner of foul substances hurled from above. A stalled ram was a dead ram. Still, when a battering ram got going, really going, it was unstoppable. Wooden muscle versus human masonry. It was ancient physics, weaponized, and it was only the beginning of how engineers would make walls weep. If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the tactician. Where rams smashed close up, catapults attacked from a distance, launching not just stones, but psychological dread. They were the first real artillery pieces in military history. And they revolutionized siege warfare by weaponizing physics in ways that felt almost magical to the enemy. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century BC, a product of brilliant minds who wanted to add range and momentum to warfare. Dionysius the Fur of Syracuse, a tyrant with a taste for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, devices that used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These weren't slingshots for giants. They were precise instruments of siege terror. The genius lay in their mechanics. Engineers figured out that by twisting ropes tightly, often made from animal sinew, they could store enormous amounts of potential energy. When released, this force could hurl stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles hundreds of meters. The two main types evolved quickly: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers who never met a Greek idea they couldn't improve. They built catapults that could be broken down, packed onto carts, and reassembled on site. Portable siege engines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could fire 60-pound stones at incredible speeds, capable of tearing through wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally unlucky soldiers. Catapults weren't just about destruction. They were about spectacle. Ancient generals used them to send messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and fear. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale. In one chilling case, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their flaws. They were heavy, required skilled crews, and could be rendered useless by bad terrain. Still, when set up properly, they could batter a city into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized their thick stone walls didn't just need to withstand a ram. They had to survive the skies. Because now destruction came flying. If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was majestic. Towering, creaking, and terrifying. It was the undisputed king of medieval siege. Warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it wasn't just a weapon.
It was a statement.
It said, "Your walls mean nothing." Unlike its tension-powered cousins, the trebuchet relied on gravity. At its core was a simple principle, a long swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame with a heavy counterow on one end and a sling on the other. Raise the weight, let it drop, and the arm would whip around, flinging the sling and its deadly payload in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and devastating. The origin of the trebuchet can be traced back to early traction models used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BC, where manpower replaced counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe got its hands on the design, it spread like wildfire through castles and crusades. The power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 m. Stones the size of furniture would crash into towers, pulverize walls, or crater enemy morale. But the real magic was in the arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with finesse. This meant they weren't just smashing defenses. They were hitting courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets hurled everything. Diseased animals burning pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, even messages or insults wrapped around rocks. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king refused to accept the surrender just so he could test the machine. But for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet wasn't fast. It took hours to build, minutes to reload, and demanded skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological horror quite like it.
It was the
medieval version of a slow-motion hammer from the heavens. And when that counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While catapults launched from afar and battering rams smashed the gates, siege towers took the more personal approach. They rolled right up to the enemy's front door and dropped off armed invaders. Imagine a wooden skyscraper on wheels covered in wet hides to prevent fire, bristling with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier and a mobile fortress. In one. And when one of these started rumbling toward your city walls, you knew that the real fight was about to begin. Siege towers weren't subtle. They were big, bold, and terrifyingly effective when used properly. The Assyrians may have been among the first to deploy them in the 9th century BC, but it was the Greeks and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms that took the design to theatrical extremes. During the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BC, the Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called the Helpolis or Taker of Cities. It was over 100 foot tall, equipped with catapults, covered in iron plates, and moved by thousands of soldiers. It also broke under its own weight. But the ambition, unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls only work if you can't get over them. Siege towers eliminated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which attackers could descend onto the battlements, bypassing gates and scaling ladders. From the top deck, archers could rain death down onto defenders, while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. But these towers weren't invincible. They were slow, vulnerable to mud, and prime targets for defenders with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even sabotage terrain. Smart defenders would dig ditches, flood mows, or build secondary inner walls, known as counter-scarp defenses, just to stop a tower's approach. Still, when they worked spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own rampart suddenly crowded. With enemy soldiers, that was chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength to a vertical race for survival. They made height an asset and a liability. And once the gangplank dropped from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand hell. While rams smashed and trebuchets soared, some of the most devastating siege tactics happened silently underground. Siege tunneling or sapping was the dark art of defeating a city by removing the ground it stood on. Literally, the idea was ancient and horrifyingly effective. Dig beneath the enemy's wall, prop it up with wooden supports, then set those supports on fire. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel collapsed, taking the foundation of the wall with it. One moment, your city stood strong. The next, a massive section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method didn't look glorious. There were no grand engines or thunderous launches, but tunneling was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians practiced early versions of it, but the technique reached full maturity with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BC, the Spartans attempted tunneling beneath the walls, only for the defenders to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them mid-dig, turning the soil into a knife-fight nightmare. This defensive tactic became known as countermining, and it added an eerie element to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in, pitch black, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, listening for the sound of enemy picks. The moment they heard tapping, they'd race to intercept, often resulting in violent, claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, just terror, suffocation, and dirt. But when undermining worked, the results were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples came in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were stunned, and soon after surrendered. By the 13th century, siege engineers became specialists in identifying weak foundations, measuring the soil's behavior, and planning collapses with terrifying precision. They were geologists and demolitionists rolled into one. And though tunneling required time, labor, and a bit of madness, it proved one truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall and you couldn't go through it, you could always take it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare came from the attackers. For every ram built or tower rolled forward, defenders had their own deadly tricks. And sometimes those tricks were hot. Let's start with the most terrifying of them all. Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantine around the 7th century CE. Greek fire was a mysterious napalm-like substance that could stick to ships, walls, and flesh and kept burning. Even on water, sprayed from siphons or hurled in clay pots, it created scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows exactly how it was made. The formula was so secret that it died with the empire, but its effects legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons within minutes. And that was just the start. In more low-tech defenses, boiling liquids were the go-to weapons of choice. Boiling water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes. Those quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers directly onto invaders below. Oil was especially feared. Unlike water, it clung to skin, soaking into clothes and armor before being set alight. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be greeted with fire you could never put out. Hot sand, though less dramatic, was vicious in its own right. It would slip into the gaps of armor, especially around the neck or wrists, causing second- and third-degree burns as it cooked the flesh beneath. It didn't look impressive from a distance, but it turned bold warriors into screaming wrecks in seconds. Defenders also relied on the good old laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto siege engines or dense formations of troops. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to break the machines and morale at once. And then there were traps. Hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles became puzzles of pain designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All of this served one purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held was a minute closer to enemy supply lines running thin, to disease spreading in camps, or to reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a game of attrition. And while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders had creativity and a whole lot of boiling rage. In siege warfare, raw destruction was only half the goal. The other half was psychological domination, breaking the will of the defenders before the walls even came down. Siege weapons weren't just tools of war. They were massive, creaking, flaming symbols of doom. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder flung by a trebuchet, was designed to plant one seed in the minds of those behind the walls. "You're not safe." Ancient commanders knew this. The Assyrians paraded their siege engines openly, dragging them across deserts with grand fanfare. The Romans built their siege camps right in view of the enemy, letting defenders watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults tested. Siege was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes, the payloads themselves carried a message. Severed heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still wearing their armor. At the Siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks, but with bodies. Diseased corpses launched to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kafir in 1346, it's believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls helped trigger outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon. It was an announcement. When one of these giants was rolled into place, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thunk of the counterweight, like the heartbeat of an incoming storm. But the most dangerous part, the unknown. You never knew what was coming next. Would it be a rock, a barrel of fire, a rain of arrows, or just silence? Ominous, heavy silence as engineers adjusted their aim. Even the sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of a battering ram or the sudden silence before a shot would drive defenders mad with anticipation. For commanders, the goal was to create despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was pointless, that their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were nothing but temporary obstacles in the path of fate. And when that mental dam finally cracked, the gates often opened without a fight. Because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind collapsed before the masonry. As gunpowder thundered onto the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines came to a slow, splintering end. But their legacy didn't vanish. It evolved. The invention of cannons changed everything. A single well-placed shot from a cannon could do in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to achieve. Stone walls, once considered impenetrable, became liabilities. By the 15th century, the great castles of Europe were crumbling, not from undermining or fire, but from iron balls crashing through their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next phase, explosive, brutal, and deafening. And yet, the principles laid down by ancient siege engineers never disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to the catapult and trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is just a high-tech descendant of the same question. How do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the story. Even military. 01:43:34 Psychology today, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, visible dominance, has its roots in ancient siege tactics. Those towering siege engines rolling forward with flags snapping in the wind were the original shock and awe. They weren't just about breaching a wall. They were about breaking the spirit of a city. You can still see their legacy etched into the ruins of ancient cities. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still scar the desert. At Constantinople, where layers of walls stood for 1,000 years against every machine imaginable, until cannon fire finally brought them down at castles across Europe, where round towers and angled bastions tell the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to survive the next siege. And today, even in a world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare hasn't vanished. It's just gone digital. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the soul of the siege remains the same.
Someone wants in.
Someone wants to keep them out. And both are willing to wait, build, and break to win. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum pieces. But the spirit of siege warfare, it's as alive and as destructive as ever.